And, well, look who's just walked back into our studio, as if he's never been away. Dr. David Starkey. David, good afternoon to you.
Hello, Ian.
Nice to see you again.
A great pleasure.
I sense that we need to get to a point where we have dancers to kind of bring David into the building.
No. I think just a fanfare, something modest.
Or a fanfare, something like that.
The Grenadier Guards, really good fanfare. Bit of a drum roll as I actually sit down.
The house band today will be the Grenadier Guards. I quite like that. That would be really fitting. Good to see you. Anyway, Happy New Year, because we haven't seen you since the end of last year. You've got a lot going on in that time. You've launched a YouTube channel as well. How's that all going?
Very well.
Good.
It's hard work.
Is it?
What do you know? You're like this.
Yeah.
You are turning them out weekly. It's a taskmaster.
Of course.
And it's quite good for you. Occasionally you think, do I really want to sit down and do this? Particularly over Christmas, the temptations of that glass of wine. And the microphone sits there looking at you reproachfully.
Do you write...
Maybe the Prime Minister should have a microphone put closer to him so that it can go reproachfully when the booze comes out.
Well, we'll come to him in a second. Yeah. Well, in terms of when you do... I mean, a little like in the days when you were lecturing, and I know you still speak in lots of different events and the like, but do you write word for word? Or are you a bullet point man?
Never. I often not even bullet points.
Right.
What I tend to do when I was doing really regular public lectures and whatever, the only thing I would have on a piece of paper in front of me was, where was I? And who was the chair? Because those were what I was going to forget.
Sure.
Whereas if it's a historical fact, once I've got it in a sequence, what I find is I think in paragraphs and I think in big block arguments and ideas. Yeah. And once I have an argument, once I've got an opening, I can usually run with it. Yeah. Every so often, the function of age, there's that terrible moment when you forget that Jerusalem is written by Blake, and you can see, as you play back the video, you can see this look of terror coming into your eyes as the words fail. You can then cut.
So there's never a fear that you're going to go up that cul-de-sac where you think, right, I've started speaking and I'm not quite sure where this bit's going.
I've never had that experience. As I said, occasionally, particularly a proper noun, an actual name, will drop out of the head, particularly if it's a modern one, particularly if what I'm trying to do is, again, it's the typical where did I leave my keys moment.
Of course.
If you're reaching out of the structure of argument, because what I always try to do when I'm lecturing publicly is you want a topical reference. Dare one tell the truth? Public speaking and pantomime have got an awful lot in common.
Absolutely.
You want the local reference. That can slip.
I mean, Boris Johnson, when he speaks, I mean, if all else fails, he throws in a bit of Latin, mumbles a little bit, and that seems to do the job for him.
It sort of stands on his head, inflates a balloon.
That's right.
That will work.
Produces a poodle.
That's right. That will work for after dinner speaking. He is finding out that running a country is ever such a little bit different. But
what are you making of him?
Generally speaking, I have always a mixed view of Boris. I mean, for heaven's sake, all of this was factored in. We knew all of this. What has generally been the case is he's got the big picture, if not righter than anybody else. He was right to be sceptical about lockdown. He's right to be sceptical about the pressure that was racked up after Christmas to go back into lockdown. So his basic instincts tend to be right. Detail, forget it. Reading state papers, forgetting it, winging it all the time. But the trouble is, real government depends, as with Thatcher, but more particularly with Boris's idol, Churchill, the real Churchill. Churchill is always big picture and devastating attention to detail. Attention to detail. And again, what I've never understood with the events, which is primed of the pandemic, of the last effectively now nearly 2 years, is that he didn't remember the key line, which Churchill has a line on this. He actually says Churchill is very used to dealing with scientists. He's got friends of them. He's got people who are regular visits called the Prof, at Chartwell and whatever. And Churchill's line is the one that Boris should have had engraved in gold letters across his desk is, you want scientists on tap, but not on top.
It's a good line, isn't it?
It's a wonderful line. And that has all gone wrong.
One would assume, as a biographer of Churchill, that Boris would know that.
I heard a wicked story that somebody else wrote the book.
Really?
What I hear?
Well, that would be a great scoop, wouldn't it?
And it was somebody who was actually exceedingly well informed, but no names, as they say, no factual. But the real problem is, why did things go so badly wrong? Yeah. And here again, you were asking, it's a choice between Cummings, Barnard Castle, Boris, Partygate. Frankly, I believe neither of them on either of them. It's as simple as that.
It might be. I think it might be right.
And I think I'm probably right. But the more important thing is, why did Boris get swept away into the whole business of SAGE, the whole business of these absurd mathematical calculations, the modelling, which is another word for tea leaves. Yeah. Mathematical modelling is a very, very elaborate word for tea leaves. Yeah. How did he get swept up? Do you know who the real guilty party is?
Go on.
It is Cummings. Cummings was the great believer in mathematical modelling. His blog
is data obsessed.
He's data obsessed. He's mathematical modelling obsessed. This, I think, was the entree. This was the way in to Downing Street of all of this stuff. Because Boris is naturally a sceptic. I doubt it. The only time... look at Boris's finances. He clearly has no notion about money. He even loses track of children, which, bearing in mind the number he has, is not difficult. But but here, how then does he become enslaved to bad mathematics? Oh, that, and one final thing. Sheer, pure panic. The last 18 months, I think if we survive, if we go back to something like normal, the way historians are going to write about this period is the Great Panic. It was an extraordinary panic. The government lost its bearings in that second weekend of March, the 12th, 13th, 14th of March. The story of that is what really needs to be written. It's when the French, when Macron is threatening to close the frontier, it's when you suddenly get a doubling of deaths. And above all, again, it's never been publicly talked about. We all know there were terrible scenes in Italian hospitals. There was a similar scene briefly in Britain at Northwick Park. And it was suppressed. Deals were done with journalists. It was not photographed. Well, it was photographed.
So that,
but they were not
saying that level of chaos.
There was then, at that point, the government simply panicked. It was sheer blind panic. And you're then delivered to SAGE, you're delivered to Neil Ferguson, you're delivered to all of this. It's panic. In the same way, the Great Panic extended to other things, the reaction to Black Lives Matter. That was a moment of complete, absurd panic. Yeah. There was no reason why the Floyd affair should have any impact in Britain at all. Our police don't kill people. They sort of, at a demonstration, they all sit back and say, oh, we mustn't interfere with their human rights.
And often paint their nails and jump on a skateboard.
Paint their nails or take the knee. It was an absurdity. That summer, as I said, in retrospect, it'll be called the Great Panic. We had one, with the outbreak of the French Revolution, the Grand Peur. Interestingly enough, exactly 300 years ago, you have the great stock market bubble of the South Sea bubble. Yeah. Again, one of these moments when extraordinary dislocation, and this is called common sense, the complete loss of common sense, group panic, absurd behaviour.
It's interesting. The one thing I think Cummings did say when he spoke to the Select Committee, remember when he gave this rather extensive, went on for absolutely hours.
He doesn't know brevity.
Absolutely. This was a guy that just clearly wanted to say lots of things and hadn't really thought that sometimes less is best or less is more and all the rest of it. But the one thing he did say, which I thought was probably true, was that nobody knew what they were doing in Downing Street, that it was, I think he even used the word panic, that, you had SAGE saying this and the Prime Minister wondering, not knowing who to listen to, and, this statistician saying something else.
But surely in those circumstances, what you should do is stick with the basic tradition of a country. Lockdown was invented in China. Lockdown depends on a suspension of civil liberties. Lockdown is all about dictatorship. I mean, to borrow a device which had been invented in China, and we're seeing now China is not yet out of lockdown. Yeah. It's persisting even more than Australia in this absurd policy of zero COVID. So cities of millions are shut down if there are 2 cases. We did something not all that dissimilar, and something, I mean, in China, that fits with the fact you've had 2,000 years of absolutism. In Britain, it fights the whole of our history.
Absolutely. Do you think, I mean, just to bring Churchill back into this...
Difficult to keep him out, isn't it?
Indeed it is. But would Boris Johnson have ever sat there and thought to himself, do you think, on a quiet night when he's sitting there with a wee dram in his hand in the prime ministerial private study, would he have thought, what would Churchill do now? Do you think he would have had that conversation?
The problem is, I don't think he knows. The evidence is what Boris is widely read in, and there's one thing he is widely read in, are the deeds of Roman emperors. And dear me, has he not put up a very good imitation of a rather bad emperor? You know, complete with an extraordinary empress in what I always call Canny Berlin. And this kind of court of chaos, because that's the other thing. I mean, just coming back to Partygate, what you've got to understand is that people talk about Downing Street as a place of work. That's only half of what it is. Yeah. It's a residence. It's a court. The Prime Minister is really our real monarch. It functions as a monarchy. The House of Commons is a bit like the Roman Senate. It's there to acclaim the emperor or to pull him down. You know? But in terms of actually how we're governed from day to day, it has very, very little impact on what actually goes on. But Downing Street is a court. And in a court, there's no frontier between public and private. In other words, the Prime Minister will take decisions when he's in bed, he's showering, he's chatting to somebody informally, he's having a drink. And this is what we've not understood. This is the real background to the Partygate business. It's also like a court. Look at the people in Downing Street. Young, clever, slightly deranged, working insane hours, overpressured, oversexed, exactly like the court of Henry VIII that I spent my misspent youth studying. Yeah. It's the flavour.
I thought you were going to say you were there for a second. That would have been
I'm not quite that old. I mean, you know, come on, you know, I know the stoop. But no, the resemblances are very, very striking.
Yeah. We will talk some more to Dr. David Starkey in a few moments here on Talk Radio. It is 23 minutes after 3 o'clock. Dr. David Starkey is with us in the studio. Let's talk a bit about the crime bill, because this has been correctly controversial for many reasons. There's lots in it. It's upset different people at different areas or different elements of the various discussions. But in particular, the House of Lords got very upset and voted it down.
Yes, I mean, I think that was partly a specialist reason that the government introduced lots of last-minute changes simply as a Lord's amendment. In other words, they've never actually been voted on by the Commons, and that is an underhand way of legislating. I think there's a bigger question, though. I think the broad thrust of what they're trying to do is right. That's to say that everybody talks about demonstration being a fundamental democratic right. Well, yes, they are, except we've now got a new kind of demonstration, like the Extinction Rebellion, which is specifically designed to be anti-democratic. It's specifically designed to force people to do things they don't want to do and that our political process doesn't want to do. And there was a very important article by Jonathan Sumption, by Lord Sumption, pointing out that the reason that they've been able to get away with it, and the reason that it's partly, of course, juries and perverse verdicts, but more fundamentally, it is because of the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, that has altered the balance, the traditional English common law balance, because obviously it's a balance between the right to protest on the one hand and the right for the rest of us to be able to go about our lawful business on the other. And what the Strasbourg Court has done, as it's done so often, is tilt the balance sharply away from the traditions of English law. The trouble is, the way to do it with legislation is very difficult. It would be much simpler if we did what the Brexiteers promised if we actually recused to a greater or lesser extent from the judgments of the Strasbourg Court, and indeed the whole European Convention. Because the point I always make with the European Convention was never intended to be law. It's a treaty. This is
Churchill again.
This is Churchill. This is Churchill and the British. But what it really amounted to was a kind of checklist or advice checklist for the new liberalising, democratising countries of Europe, saying these are the sort of considerations you ought to have in mind, which is why it reads completely unlike a law. If you look, for example, at the equivalent section of the Bill of Rights in America on freedom of speech, it's completely simple. Congress shall not make rules that govern this, govern that. If you look at the equivalent section in the Convention, it says something very different. It says there shall be a right of freedom of speech subject to considerations of religion, public decency, political order, all of which, of course, either require an elaborate legislative framework or, if you turn it into a body of law, it effectively gives the judges the power to determine everything. It's a carte blanche to judges. And again, it's a good Churchill point. I think it's Churchill who says the rule of law doesn't mean the rule of judges.
And it's interesting when you look at...
Or the rule of lawyers.
The rule of lawyers. When you look at this, I mean, the Extinction Rebellion, gluing yourself to the M25 or the top of a train or stopping ambulances, getting to the local hospital, etc. So where is that line? I mean, what is the? I mean, these are the moralities of laws and the rights of human beings, and where it all clashes and comes together. Yes, you have the right to protest. That's great. We're in a democracy. It's not North Korea. However, you don't have a right to stop me getting to the hospittal.
See, this seems to me to be the. I mean, one of the great rights of an Englishman was the right to use the Queen's Highway. To go where you're entitled to go. This is deliberately designed to stop people doing things which are legal and which are their rights. It's one group of people, a very small group of people, saying because effectively we are divinely empowered, because we are more virtuous than you are, because we care more about the environment than you do, we will force you. We will force you and compel you. In other words, it's the point I made about the beginning. It pretends to be democratic. It's fundamentally anti-democratic, which I think is one of the reasons why the Lords dislikes the legislation, because anywhere more fundamentally anti-democratic than our House of Lords, with that huge Remainer majority, couldn't be thought of.
It's a really good point. As I once had a huge argument in Lewisham, in South London, while I was in a car.
One always has arguments in Lewisham.
Indeed, it's the place to go. It's a Monty Python sketch. Is this the right borough for an argument? And so there I was. I had an altercation with a cyclist, and the argument began, and he was I was in slow traffic, he was alongside the car, and I suddenly clocked, after about 5 minutes of this argument, that his template for the argument was that he was a better person than me.
Of course, because you're on a bike.
Indeed,
you're a wicked polluter of the environment.
That was exactly it.
Virtue.
So he was
virtue.
In his world. He was punching up, so that was okay.
It was virtue. No, he's punching down. He's on the side of God.
Well, yes,
you're on the side of the devil.
But I might have been Saddam Hussein as far as he was concerned.
You probably were. I mean, you're doing environmental damage. That makes you wicked. It's complete Animal Farm. 2 wheels good, 4 wheels bad.
Yes, it's never lost on me that analogy. Absolutely right.
Just absolutely.
Yeah, I can't say on air what I eventually said to him before I legged it, but I did end up leaving with his bike lock, which was a curious moment in the exchange. Just tell us.
How on earth did you get?
Oh, it was a long story. I'll have to go over the whole thing. I'll tell you later. The YouTube channel is called David Starkey Talks. And you've done a few of these now, haven't you? So these are they weekly?
Twice weekly. Twice weekly.
So there's a good body of work on it.
There's a lot of work on it. My most recent one, which I recorded this morning, I've discovered all sorts of new things about Colston's statue. You know, the famous thing that was torn down and chucked in the harbour. I now know why it was put up. Nothing to do directly with Colston. It was that Bristol had an inferiority complex in the late 19th century because it had fallen behind. It had been a great city in the 18th century. century. In the 19th century, it gets it wrong. It miscalculates over sea traffic, and instead of all the ocean liners departing from Bristol, which they were supposed to do, they all go off and hive off and leave from Liverpool. It isn't a great Victorian city. And what you get at the end of the 19th century is a group of extraordinary people in Bristol, led by one particular individual, really. I've become very fond of him. He's a publisher, he's a printer, he's a liberal politician, a remarkable man called James Arrowsmith. And the thing that we'll all know about him, even though you don't know it, he's the publisher of Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat.
Oh, there you go.
And it's on the back of that. He says, what we've got to do, we've got to try, it's so modern, we've got to try and actually pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We have got to regenerate culturally. Sounds like Michael Heseltine at Liverpool. And he launches a great exhibition in Bristol. The exhibition is on a large section of reclaimed land. So suddenly Bristol has got a big open space that looks a bit like Albert Square in Manchester. And what does Albert Square in Manchester have? It's got the great town hall on one side. They can't build that. But it's got statues. It's like the Roman Forum. And what he intends to do is to give Bristol statues of local worthies. That's why Colston's put up. It's nothing to do particularly with Colston. It is the idea that Bristol has fallen behind. It needs, to coin a phrase, levelling up, and you level up with statues.
There it is. We managed to get Michael Heseltine and Winston Churchill into this conversation. Who'd have thought those two names would ever sit in the same postcode, let alone the same conversation?
I can only imagine what Churchill would have thought.
Indeed. David, thank you. Good to see you again.